Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Coyotes, in which the Sharks have lost 6-3. So a somewhat lopsided score. However, a couple of those goals were empty net goals, so this was a lot closer than it may have seemed. And so this first period started off, and the Sharks were actually playing rather well. They were getting a few solid chances. They just couldn't really convert up until Phil Kessel scored for the Coyotes to make it 1-0. At that point, it seemed as though the Coyotes completely took over the game. They would have added a second goal from Phil Kessel as well, all the way up until the point where the Sharks got their first goal of the game. That would be Kevin Labanc making it 2-1. Then the Sharks started to come back, actually get some pressure, and Timo Meier would be able to tie it up, and we'd have a whole new hockey game. And began to think back to that first game the Sharks played against the Coyotes this season, where the Sharks trailed 2-0, ended up tying it up 2-2 and eventually winning that game, but that was not in the cards here tonight. It would be the Coyotes late in the second period getting a pretty lucky goal from Taylor Hall to make it 3-2. Eventually, it would be Krause to add up to 4-2, and Garland and Hall would add 2 empty netters. And the tale of this game is basically just some big mistakes coming from the Sharks defensively, just leading to these easy goals for the Coyotes. That first goal by Phil Kessel is just a bad turnover by Timo Meier. Poor coverage on the penalty kill leads to the second Phil Kessel goal. Awful coverage in the defensive zone by, one of Carlson, Hertl, and Kane. It's hard to deduce exactly who. Kane just completely abandons Lawson Krause. You could certainly make the argument that one of Carlson or Hertl should have been covering him anyhow, but he's left all alone in front. So that ended up being the game winner of the game. So just some missed opportunities from the San Jose Sharks on the defensive side, but also the offensive side, as they were against a third string goaltender. And while Adin Hill is pretty decent, honestly, he was actually decent for the Coyotes last season. It's not necessarily the best goaltender in the NHL, so hopefully it was a hope that the Sharks could take a bit more advantage, especially with a lot of the great chances they did have, just didn't end up converting. So a pretty big loss here to a division rival. Not the end of the world, considering the top brass of the Pacific Division is all really close together. Coyotes, Oilers, Flames, Canucks, Golden Knights are all within just a couple of points of each other, so the Sharks don't have to pass every single one of them, only having to pass a couple of them to still make it to the playoff spot. Considering where the Sharks sit now, 34 games left in the season at 46 points, they're probably going to need about 95, 96 points to make it, meaning in their last 34 games, they probably have to win about 25 of them, going 25-9, which is a pretty tall task, not impossible, but would be an insane stretch to go on. So the foot is in the door for the San Jose Sharks, but it's beginning to close. First thing to talk about would be Aaron Dell, as he once again got the start here tonight. He was pretty decent, I guess. A few of these goals he didn't have much of a chance on. The Hall one, of course, was just a bit of a lucky bounce. Both of those Kessel ones, you could argue he could have had a chance on, but that first Kessel shot was just insane, and the second one is an extremely sneaky shot, honestly. But you could also make the argument Dell should have probably had at least one of these goals, so it wasn't a great game from Aaron Dell like we've seen in the previous few. And so, considering he's now had, 4 straight starts in a row, I would not be surprised to see Martin Jones be finally given another look at on Thursday when they play again against the Avalanche, even though that will be another tough opponent. Next, I will talk about Marcus Sorensen. I mentioned him in my previous review, and I said he was beginning to actually look a lot better on that third line after he had a pretty long stretch where he was mostly ineffective. He once again looked quite good here tonight, maybe one of the Sharks' better forwards. While there were probably forwards on the Sharks who generated greater chances than Sorensen, Sorensen was one of the few who didn't make so many mistakes. For instance, Meier, Evander Kane, both those players generated a lot of offense, but also made some pretty critical mistakes in this game. So a solid game for Marcus Sorensen as he begins to continue to improve and has gone back to what we love from Marcus Sorensen, some solid play while not contributing on the scoreboard, which seems to be the case for him. And finally, I will mention Tomas Hertl, as he had a pretty decent game offensively, but just a bit of a mention here. You take a look at his plus-minus, which I'm sure a lot of people do not like as a stat, and it's pretty low for Tomas Hertl, down very deep into the negatives. And it's an issue with Hertl is that he reminds me sort of like Brent Burns, except for Hertl is, of course, a forward player. He just finds himself getting a bit lost in the defensive zone, maybe a bit overwhelmed in the defensive zone. He finds himself watching the puck frequently, so while he can be decent defensively, as is the case with Burns, there's just when there seems to be too much puck movement going around, Turtle finds himself just watching the puck way too much and leaving players wide open. So I'm not going to say that the Sharks shouldn't keep playing Tomas Hertl defensively. Obviously, he plays a decent role on the penalty kill, but I'd like to see Hertl maybe get a bit more composed in that area. He's one of the top centermen in the league, honestly, when you take a look at his stats this year, and you especially take a look at his stats last year. And when you're a centerman, you do have that extra bit of defensive responsibility, and we see Couture take that and run with it. Couture is one of the only players on the Sharks who actually has that plus rating, if not the only player on the Sharks with the plus rating. And so seeing Hertl that much further down in the negative 20s is quite disappointing. And when you watch him, you can technically see why. So I feel like that's something he needs to work on, as he has really transitioned since last year into this center role. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, as I said, against the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche started the season off very, very well, but they have cooled down a bit as of late. However, still an extremely dangerous team, an extremely deep team. This will also be the first time the Sharks will be playing against Jonas Donskoy this season. Of course, former San Jose Shark for a few years, had that big overtime game winner in the Stanley Cup playoffs in 2016. And of course, the return of McKinnon, Landeskog, Rantanen here to play against the Sharks for the first time since the Game 7 victory against the Avalanche. So I'm sure they'll be looking to get some revenge. And the Sharks in desperate need of trying to rack up these wins. So if Jones starts, maybe Dell will get the start. All things considered, the Sharks really need those 2 points. Class dismissed.